In prior lectures, we've gone over how the shape of the bones are. We've gone over how the bones were developed in the first place, and we've gone over the jobs of the cells that help create bone. Now, during your teen years, how do you actually grow the sizes of your bones? They're going to still be the same rough shape. So your humerus, your femur, the big long bones in your body, they're still going to have the same shape. But all we want to do in this stage of our life is make them bigger. So you can grow taller or grow them wider so that they can support more weight. So this process is called elongation or widening, the process of getting those bones themselves to, even though they maintain the same shape, to get bigger. And how is this affected by age? How has its development changed over time as we get older? So we're going to go over the two types of ways our bones grow. The biggest one we're going to go over, though, is elongation. So bone elongation is just your bone growing in length. So our bone's going this way. And that's mainly going to occur at the epiphyseal plate that was formed during that was left behind during the development of the bone itself. So when your bones are developed, they develop in the middle and then they develop at the ends. And then what's left behind is this region of cartilage. So that epiphyseal plate or cartilage strip between the two regions, that has a capability of growing in terms of cartilage. And then what happens is the edge that's by the diaphysis fills in with bone. Okay? So this picture is not super great, but what happens here is, let me draw a picture. We have our bone here, right? And we have just our thin layer of cartilage, and then we have our bone underneath here. But what ends up happening is first the cartilage grows, okay? And our bone is now longer, but there is this cartilage in the middle. And then what ends up happening is one edge of the cartilage converts over to bone. So that epiphyseal line is the same length, but now the area that's closer to the middle is now bone. All right? So our stages of bone elongation. What happens is around our edges of this cartilage plate, it's a little crusty because it's bone. So what you're going to need is you're going to need to soften the edges of the epiphyseal plate. So you're going to actually have osteoclasts remove the edge of our bone closer to the epiphysis to make it softer so that that cartilage can super expand. Okay? Then, as our cartilage fills in, you're then going to have the edge, again, as we showed before, fill in with bone on the edge of that epiphyseal plate that's closer to the diaphysis. And because you're forming bone, your osteoblasts are now in play. And this is going to keep happening as you grow. But what actually happens is, as your cartilage grows, the ability for you to form lots of cartilage kind of is more limited, but you're still filling in a decent amount of bone. So over time, what's going to happen is this epiphyseal plate is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And by the time you're older, the epiphyseal plate is going to be basically, instead of cartilage, replaced with a line of bone. Okay? So, at that point, that structure that's left behind, we call it an epiphyseal line. When it converts all to bone, you just see kind of this strip of compact bone where the cartilage used to be, and then your bone is now all one piece with no cartilage between the ends and the middle. So, that actually is something you can see if you slice the bone in half. But one of the interesting things about this is if someone dies in their late 20s, their long bone, like their bone in the middle of their leg, it will stay one piece. But if someone dies in their teens, perhaps, or as a small child, let's say if you're a criminal investigator, what happens is, because cartilage rots, what happens is this bone would then break and separate into completely separate pieces. And you can actually see that in the skeleton, and that's one big way that forensic biologists can eyeball what they think the age of someone is. So if someone looks like the size of an adult, but their bone is in separate pieces when it should be one big piece, they can tell it's probably a teenager or someone in their early 20s. So this is just a picture of a microscope, basically, slice of the bone. So you can kind of see where the cartilage is versus the bone. So this blue pale stuff is cartilage, and then the purple is bone. All right, so the significance of this in terms of x-ray, though, is your cartilage is actually see-through in x-ray. So, or more see-through than bone. So what ends up happening is you see this kind of see-through line in the middle of the ends of the bones in people who are under 25. Compare that to a fully developed adult, and in this case, their epiphyseal line is filled in and their bone is actually not gonna have that stripe through it at the ends. All right, their bone is filled in, but you see the remnants, the imprint of where the cartilage used to be, and you can actually see that on the edges of a long bone. You can kind of see this, and that's just a phenomenon that ends up happening when that epiphyseal plate finally converts completely to a bony line. So, look at these two images. It should be pretty straightforward, but figure out which one's the adult, and which one's a child, and which one's a plate, and which one's a line. Take a moment. All right, so if you can tell, the young picture is the one on the right side, so this is the child, and they have a plate. The one to the left, because you don't see a crack in the bone ends, that's how we know it's epiphyseal line, and it's an adult. And that line, that crack-ish of cartilage is now fully bone in the adult. So, one of the things that may impact you as teenagers is something called epiphyseal fractures. Now, when you're growing, what happens is you have hard bone, and then you have this soft, flexible section in between your bone, and when you're a teenager, this is the age where you like to be active, at least for those of you who are athletes in pre-pandemic times. So in this case, what ends up happening, especially in young adults that do high stress sports like basketball, football, gymnastics, stuff like that, you end up putting a lot of stress sometimes on your bones, and sometimes you end up cracking and snapping your epiphyseal plate. But what ends up happening is because that cartilage isn't visible on the x-ray, if you break it, it's really hard to diagnose, and you can't really see it without an MRI or CT. So some doctors don't necessarily acknowledge a break or will realize there's a break, and you might have to fight the doctor a little bit to get them to, especially if you have ongoing pain at the end of your bones, to get them to do something beyond an x-ray, a CT or MRI of your bones, so you can actually check if it's broken. Because what happens if they don't diagnose it is you'll continue to wear away and tear and damage your epiphyseal plate. And what that can do over time, because this is the area where your bones grow, is it can severely damage that plate to the point where it will grow unevenly or maybe even stop to grow. And this is where sometimes if you get a broken bone in the wrong place, it will stunt the growth in that bone, and then you might have like a slightly longer leg on one side or a slightly longer arm on one side. I had a student the other year who cracked their collarbones, and they actually were like, yeah, one collarbone is shorter than the other because they cracked it in the epiphyseal plate at the wrong point in their life, basically. Now compare that to a break in the middle of your bone. So a typical break that's not in the epiphyseal line, it sucks, definitely, but it's just bone that can then be replaced. But the epiphyseal plate is where you're growing your bone. And if that's damaged so badly that the cells are not going to grow, or maybe the cells will grow eventually, but this cell is growing, or this plate is growing perfectly fine, while the other one has like a year or half a year of time for it to repair. So it's like a year or half a year behind in growth. You're going to get that uneven length on your right versus your left side. All right. The second way your bones can grow is something called appositional growth. This isn't quite bone widening depending on how it's used. So it's adding more bone to your bones, but in a different way. So instead of making your cartilage regions of your bones expand and then convert to bone, this is going to take the bone that exists and just throw more bone on top of it. Generally speaking, this is mainly on the surface of your bones. So you're going to take the edges of your bone, clean it up by sanding it away with osteoclasts, and then toss on new bone on top of it, osteoblasts. All right? Now, depending on how you do it, you can widen or make your bone actually grow in terms of width, or you can just keep the same size. So if you want to widen bone, what you're going to do is you're going to take your bone that you have, and then you're just going to lay down more bone on the outside edge. But again, you want to keep the balance. You don't want your bones super thick, because then that compact bone gets in the way and also makes your bones really heavy. So what we're going to do is you're going to take osteoclast to clean up the inside and thin it out so that the compact bone edges are still thin. All right, so we're going to take osteoclast to chew out the inside while your osteoblasts are rebuilding on the outside, and that's going to allow you to widen your bones. However, you don't have to do it this way. You can also just take the bone you have. So let's say this is just your bone, right? I'll just color it solid. And what you can do is you can just chew out the old crappy bone on the edges and just replace it with the same amount of bone that was there in the past. Just replace it with new bone. So your bone is nice and new. You replace the old crappy bone, but you didn't add anything extra to it. So both of these are appositional growth, but just depending on where you're removing bone and where you're adding bone to, you can actually widen your bones or just keep it the same size. So growth, especially when it comes to length, is done through cartilage expanding and then being replaced by bone. Right over here. Remodeling is a word that happens through, is when you don't actually grow anything. And that can be done through appositional growth. So the growth is a little bit of a misnomer. You are growing bone, but you did remove some bone in the first place if you're doing remodeling. Or you can do appositional growth and cause widening, which is bone widening. And that is a kind of growth in terms of diameter, depending on what you're doing. Okay? So, just a heads up. Appositional growth is adding new bone, but you may actually not have a bigger bone at the end of the day if you're just replacing what you already removed. Or you can have a wider bone, again, depending on how you lay it down. This last bit isn't really notes, you don't have to write it down, but just for some of you, if you didn't realize this, growing pains is actually fairly common. 15% of students actually experience this, especially in their adolescence when you're growing pretty quick. And actually, there's no evidence that your bones physically growing is painful. And we're not 100% sure why it occurs, but it tends to occur at the end of the day, not at the beginning of the day, which is an indication then that the more likely reason why you might have bone pains as you're growing is just overuse of your bones during the day when your bones aren't at their strongest because they're growing, so there's a lot of cartilage involved. And because your bones are growing, they're kind of creating your ligaments and all the things holding your bones together haven't quite caught up sometimes, so they're maybe a little stretchy and a little bit looser, so it's just a lot easier overall for those things to strain themselves if you're really active during the day, and that's what might lead to growing pains. Alright, so key takeaway. Bone elongation is mainly done through expansion of the cartilage and then converting cartilage to bone, particularly at the epiphyseal plate. When that plate completely converts into bone or calcifies into bone, that's what we call that epiphyseal plate, the epiphyseal line. And at that point, you won't grow taller. And this happens at approximately the age of 25, more or less depending on genetics. Some of you will have it close up in your early 20s. Some of you will have it close up later than that. And generally, the growth you do at your very early 20s is very minimum. I think I gained like half an inch in 5 years, something like that, compared to your like middle school and high school years. And finally, appositional growth is just adding more bone tissue to your existing bone, and you can use that to widen your bones or maintain the same shape. All right, that concludes the lesson. Move on to anything else you have for the day. Bye.